Well, thanks for joining us here at Operationally Speaking. I'm your host, Tina DiMarino, and we are here today with Molly de Lima-Campos. She is the interior designer and senior project manager for E4H Architecture. And I have to say, Molly and I have worked together for the last 6 years on many, many projects, both large and small. Very attention to detail and has a lot of wisdom and knowledge. So today we want to talk about building an ambulatory surgery center, though very worthwhile and profitable, with the right mix of specialties and cases. And at the beginning of this process, we are looking for space. And with that comes a multitude of factors to consider. So Molly's here with us today, and she's going to share some of those things that she sees that can save you considerable time and money when choosing the right space.
Well, I think initially, there's a lot of factors to consider when you're looking at a space, whether you're looking at it on your own or if you have maybe a broker that you're working with, kind of the right space. I think initially size is going to be a big factor, and that size comes into play with what you actually need for your space. And then that impacts kind of your cost up front too, with the lease that you may have with a landlord, or if you're even considering kind of buying your own facility. Square footage comes at a high price sometimes. So the better that we can narrow down the square footage that you're looking for your facility, the better. First off, how many procedure rooms or operating rooms are you looking to have? I think that plays the biggest factor. And the size of those operating rooms is also dependent on what type of procedures you're doing. You could have a smaller operating room for cases that may not require as much equipment, but let's say you're doing orthopedics.
Orthopedics, for sure. That's a really good point, Molly. What are some of the common sizes that you see for specialties or number of rooms?
Some common sizes that I've seen to work out best for room numbers to start off with a range. If you have, let's say, a one room facility, so that is the one room being your procedure room or your operating room, the amount of square footage I've seen that's worked really well would be about 3,000 to 5,000 square feet. That allows you to have that procedure room along with all the support spaces that are needed. Next range, let's say a two room, I'd say maybe 8,000 to 10,000 square feet is a good range to think about.
Room, you have to consider your throughput, pre-op bays, post-op bays. So if you add
Exactly.
more rooms, more spaces, absolutely. Is there any specific type of building that you see works better? We've had physicians come to us and say, here, I have a condo. What can we do in this space? Or here's a house, is this zoned, or, different buildings? What would be your recommendation on the best building to kind of look at in certain areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the things that we as interior designers and architects look at is what they call the construction type. And that's honestly something we always ask for right off the bat. And I know that it's not necessarily something that everyone else understands what that means. But it's really the materials that the building is made out of. And if you can get this information from the landlord, the building itself, it really helps a lot, because what that tells us, that construction type tells us really the fire rating that we have. That's a huge factor in choosing your location, because inherently your ASC is going to need to be fully separated from all adjacent tenants by a 1 hour rating. And fully separated not only means the walls, so your vertical walls that surround your space, but also your horizontal separations. So if you are, let's say, on the second floor of a 4-story building, you need to have a 1 hour rating between you and the tenant below and you and the tenant above. And sometimes that's really hard to get in a building that isn't inherently fire rated between floors. That doesn't mean you can't move forward with that type of building. We certainly have with many cases, but it's just going to essentially add to your cost, because there are ways to fireproof and get that rating. But they don't come cheap. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to work with adjacent tenants,
Sure.
especially below, who may not necessarily want you in their space to do this type of work. But those types of build that initially just what that construction type is and the fire rating. Some other things to take into consideration is if you're able to get into a building that maybe already has some medical use in it, that might give you an edge. Other requirements that you need for your facility, a lot of times I've seen it recently in a project, honestly, where there's the existing building doesn't have the electrical capacity what we need for the space,
Right.
and the tenant has to consider adding in a new panel, and that's a lot. That's
That
a
can be
lot of
pretty
money to,
pricey. Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty pricey. So it's really ideal that if you can kind of look at that infrastructure that's already there to see that that helps. But usually if it's a building already used for medical use, especially if it's already being used for ambulatory, then you're likely going to be in a good position. I'd say some other things with these buildings, because there are some specific requirements with your parking, your zoning. So there's certain spaces that are required for ambulatory use, the number of spaces. So look for a place that has a pretty big parking, required to have a covered walkway from the entry to your car pickup. Most buildings around have that, but I've seen it where they don't, and we've had to add it in. Again,
Right.
another cost that would be better suited for the building to have taken care of than you to carry it on your own, because likely the landlord's going to make you pay for it because it's your requirement.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Is there any level in a building that's better than others for an ambulatory surgery center?
Yeah, I'd say the ideal level is probably the first level for a variety of reasons. One being that, again, you don't have to deal with a tenant who's below you. So aside from that rating that you may have needed to meet, likely you're going to have a lot of plumbing in your space, because there's a lot of plumbing that's
Yeah.
required for these surgery centers. And that means that you aren't then drilling into somebody else's space from above. If you're on the ground floor, yes, it's a little more work to what they call trenching, to go through that existing concrete that's on the ground, but it's just going to be a lot easier than going through someone else's space.
Right.
Another benefit of being on the first level is that you don't have to deal with elevators. You don't have to deal with the making sure that the elevators are sized appropriately for emergency use for a stretcher, because if it's not a medical type building, there's a chance they aren't. And that's something that is really hard to modify. So not having to deal with that. You have the opportunity to have a storefront entrance, which is really nice for having a presence for your facility, that you really capture tenants coming in, your, or not your tenants, your patients coming in, just having
Mhm.
that, have great signage, maybe something else you can work with the landlord on. So that helps a lot. And also, I've actually seen that the first level tends to have a higher slab height. So you have more room between the floor and the floor, your floor on the bottom and the floor above, which
Oh,
is really helpful when you're doing a lot of above ceiling work, your mechanical work. You got a lot of duct work running through, so that's going to take a lot of space above your ceiling, but also any structural impacts that you have. So if you have OR lights that you're hanging or
yeah.
equipment booms, the more space you have to work with, the better it'll be. And it allows you to have better ceiling heights, especially in those operating rooms.
Right.
Ideally, we'd all love to have 10-foot high ceilings. That is pretty optimal for the work and what physicians prefer. But, you know, it's hard to get that on a floor that's above the first floor. You have a better chance getting it on the first floor.
We've been in situations before where we would come onto a project and it had already begun, the design was done, construction's underway, and they go to hang the lights and realize, wow, like I'm
Yeah.
short in stature, that if we wouldn't have retrofitted back up into the ceiling, I would bonk my head on it, So
Mm-hmm.
I know that that's definitely an important consideration from experience and what we've seen over the years. I just wanted to ask about the elevator size. Is there a specific width, a depth dimension that is required? Is there a minimum? I don't mean to put you on the spot for numbers or anything, but is there? Because I do know that that seems to always come up, in some of the more city locations that are in the high rises, is the elevator suitable or not? Is there a specific size? Does the stretcher have to go in and lie flat, or can they sit up? Just out of
Yeah.
curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there is a specific size I believe it's 2 people with the stretcher as well. Now, it doesn't have to be the same size as, let's say, a hospital elevator where you're transporting stretchers. You know, those elevators are really
Mm.
big. You don't need that size unless if you happen to have a facility where you're utilizing 2 floors and you are going to be transporting, you know, non-emergency transport between those 2 floors, you need to have those larger elevators. But for emergency transport, you can have, I believe you can have the stretcher, doesn't have to be all the way flat, but you need to be able to have the other 2 people in it. And it is larger than a typical size. One of the things that with buildings that are over a certain number of floors. So there are high rises that inherently have that larger elevator as part of their elevator bank. So that is something to look for. But if there is any concern or you go and look at these elevators, I would say before you decide on this space, have those elevators measured to make sure that at least one of those will fit those size requirements. And, you know, when you, whatever architect you end up working with, that's something I would, you know, if you want to engage them to confirm that, because that may make a difference. If you certainly don't want that coming up at the end when you've already built everything out.
Oh gosh, no, no, that's great advice. Absolutely. And we've seen some really tiny elevators over the years, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and probably before some of these different codes and things have come into play over the years too. What other considerations are there with,
Your structural engineer is also going to put on board for generator. Now, not all ASCs are going to require a generator, but pretty much all ASCs are going to require battery backup or backup of some type for emergency power. That's definitely a requirement. Most smaller spaces or smaller facilities, we've been able to utilize UPS backup system. So you can keep that within your space and your IT closet. So I've seen more on maybe a 1-room facility,
right?
maybe 2, but it's really just stuck with a 1-room facility that you can majority of the time get away with just that battery backup, the UPS. But in all other cases, likely a generator you're going to have to use, and that generator is going to go outside. So that's another consideration to talk to your landlord about.
Oh, yeah,
A, am I allowed to put a generator out here? B, if I do, where can it go? And that's something that you would engage your landlord with. And then there's a chance you may need to engage a civil engineer for projects right now that we had to engage a civil engineer for because let's say that the topography around the building is a little slanted. There may be some retaining walls. So they're ensuring that that generator can actually go there and how we can support it. Typically, it's put on a concrete pad. The generators come at a definitely a higher cost. So if you're going up into those multi-room facilities, keep that in mind.
yeah, absolutely. And do you recommend, so when you walk your space, do you recommend walking that space with your architect so that way they can kind of pick things out that they're looking at to say, we might want to check into this further, like you're talking about with the generator. And then if they see that the topography is slanted or a little off, just not flat, that they would then say, we're going to need to get a structural engineer and maybe kind of look at these things ahead of signing a lease or certainly purchasing if you're going
Yeah.
to, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful. I know that it's not always feasible for the project and for the process. If it is something that can be taken advantage of in the beginning, I think it certainly helps a lot. You know, a lot of architects firms, along with their engineers, will offer what they call a feasibility study of the space, where if there's a space that you're considering, the architect and the engineer will go into that space and kind of do their own evaluation and provide a report of here are things that basically pros and cons. Here's things that are great for your type of facilities. Here are things that we've seen that may be a little more difficult, maybe more challenging, or if there's something, hey, this just isn't going to work for these reasons. And you know, I know the thing with that is that sometimes it is an added cost up front to get that information, but you know, sometimes with these type of investments, it's worth it to make sure that you're really getting the space that suits your needs and not just kind of hoping that it works out.
Right. And two, putting that little bit of money, I don't want to say a little bit, but putting that money up front for that feasibility study makes complete sense that you don't sign a lease or purchase a building and then come to find out you're going to have to add in six figures just to bring it up to speed before you even
Exactly.
start, you know? So
Yeah. Those reports can tell you, here's some big costs that are probably going to impact, and you can be better prepared for it and see if that's worth it, or maybe we go to a different building that some of those costs we don't is already taken care of.
So tell us a little bit about the process for finding that space and then taking us through all the way to construction docs.
Yeah, so once you have that space selected, and it helps to have signed the lease before we get really started into it, but I've seen it go both
Sure.
ways. You and your architect will set up a programming. You've already had an initial estimate of this is about the size that I'm looking for, but let's really dig into what your program needs are, because even though there are requirements and certain ratios we need to keep as far as operating rooms and patient bays and restrooms, those sorts of things, depending on how your facility works, those ratios could change. And that's something that we'd want to talk through. So instead of 3 patient bays, maybe you need 5 because your turnovers are so quick. Do you want to have universal bays that can be used for pre-op and recovery, so that's a little more flexible based on time of day and when you have the most patients? Or do you want a distinct separation between pre-op and recovery? So those are things to work through with the programming. And that's kind of our schematic design phase, where we're going through the layouts and really fine tuning how this space works out for you, and that you'll go back and forth with your architect. Your architect will present different options. You'll have a few meetings to go through the layout, discuss what works, what doesn't, until you get to that final, yes, this works great. I love this layout. Let's move next. Next phase would be design development, and that's where you'll have your architect's going to be working on the drawings to get them a little more refined. And those could come down to, what type of cabinets do you want? Do you want drawers? Do you want cabinets? Do you want open shelving?
I was just gonna say that's always the fun part,
Yeah.
designing the room,
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And then there's so many options, and it's different for every physician. So, we as architects and designers can give an idea, or at least a starting point of, here's what we've seen, and then you tell us, yep, that works great, or no, I'd rather have this or this. So that gets us into our design development. So that's just really refining those kind of detailed items that are specific to your space. Goes into construction documents, and that's really where your architects and designers and engineers are heads down, just pumping through those sets to get everything that's required to submit for permit and for bid. So every sort of detail, how the space is truly going to be constructed, down to what that, the size of the wall is going to be, and how that cabinet is actually made. So those are really specific details. And then also meeting all the requirements of the permit office, and also the regulations that you all need to go through for your
Right.
licensing. So like our life safety plan. So making sure that we have those firewalls where we need them. There's also some cases where if your surgery center is over 10,000 square feet, you smoke barrier. So you need to have separation that way as well. That's what we are working on as far as our life safety plan. And I know that's what's looked at pretty heavily during your inspections, to make sure
Yes.
that we're meeting all those codes, that we have our fire extinguishers in the right places, we have the right amount of fire extinguishers and our exit signs, and everybody can leave and do all these things. So that's your construction documents. And usually you'll have a couple meetings with the architect then. And once that is signed off, then we go to bid, then we go to permit. Usually they're submitted at the same time. So your county, your jurisdiction is reviewing the permit, reviewing the drawings to make sure that we've met all the codes and the space is good from their end. You have options. You can engage the architect to help with reviewing the bids. You definitely want to have a contractor that is experienced in healthcare, because it is a lot different, a lot of things to look at versus residential or commercial or even hospitality. So if you can find a contractor that has that experience, that's hands down what we would absolutely recommend. The architect can give you some contractors they would recommend if you don't have any on your own, or we can do a combination if there's someone you've worked with before that you'd like to have them bid on the project. And yeah, if it's part of your contract with the architect can go ahead and review the bids, help answer any questions that come through, and, give recommendations if they're wanted. And then you select your contractor, and we move on to the next phase of actually building it out. I would definitely recommend keeping an architect on board during this construction process. It helps
Oh,
with making sure that the space is being built as designed, but there's a lot of things that are, and they were designed a certain way for a certain reason. The architect is going to know the most about why and work with the contractor of how to make that design happen if there's any hangups. And it also kind of takes some pressure off of you as the physician who's building out this space. This is our job, and you have your job of, being a doctor. So, that way we're not taking, the job isn't taking away your time from doing your job. I do think it's great to have the physicians engaged during construction. We're certainly
yeah.
not trying to like shut anybody out. I think it's a really important to have collaboration and understanding, a lot of communication throughout the process, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I always appreciate when the architect is involved throughout the process, working with the contractors coming in, doing their site visits, ensuring that it is being built as designed, the architect coming in, and lo and behold, it seems that there are always, hangups here and there. So I highly recommend that. And going back a second to the construction documents, and I know you mentioned about meetings. I know one thing that I always appreciate is having that meeting where you bring absolutely every stakeholder into the room, all your different mechanical people, and go room by room, on that 75% check set to make sure that each room has the right amount of plugs or the right amount of lighting, talking about, what kind of temperature needs there are, but having that physician and their team there, those who are going to be maybe working in the operating room as well. I just find that when everybody goes through that room to room discussion during the check set, we usually find one or two things or maybe something to improve before everything gets finalized and then off to the next stages. Do you agree with that? Do you see that often or?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And what can sometimes be difficult is that the project starts with almost a different end user. You may have some physicians and nurses on board in the beginning, and then throughout the process, if it happens to be kind of a longer one for one reason or another, you have new people come on board, or you've hired new people that now is, let's
Yeah.
say, your head nurse who's there, and why was everything designed this way? Um,
Yeah.
so that can be tough, but I absolutely agree, the best we can. And I mean, that happens all the time, even down to things of where do you want your light switch located? Where do you want your push plate to open the doors going in and coming out? Do you want different zones for your lighting, or are you fine with everything as is? Do you want them to be dimmable? The flow of the space, I like having the team on board that is going to be working in that space is so helpful because again, like every space is different and we can only work with what we've seen other facilities how they've operated, but only you are going to know how yours operates, and at the end of the day this is your space and we want you to be happy with it. So
Right.
absolutely, please come on board and
And help.
let's vet it all out.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you recommend the use of an expediter? Can you tell us a little bit about that for
Yeah,
permit?
absolutely. I definitely recommend the use of an expediter. An expediter is going to have a pretty good relationship with the jurisdiction that you're going to. So really, everything's that is required, different forms, different the sheet sizes. There's some
Sure.
jurisdictions that have a completely different sheet size, and we as the designers and architects are trying we're doing everything we can to stay on top of which jurisdiction, what are the requirements for it. But having that expediter, then we're submitting the drawings to them. They're then coming checking our set before it even goes through. So we're not getting held up because, our plan had the wrong route, like wrong number on it. It's rare that I do a project without an expediter.
That
And I
makes
think that's,
sense.
yeah, I think that's
Mhm.
pretty common and pretty typical across the board.
Oh, awesome. Okay. What other considerations, for finishes and things like that, should we consider to help save some time and money as we're going through this process?
Yeah, I think some things, if there aren't any thing that you're really set on as far as finishes and fixtures, we can offer suggestions of those items that maybe come in at a lower cost, still meet all the standards, still look really great. We're not, sending you something, suggesting something that's going to fall apart or,
Yeah.
crumble as soon as you touch it. Everything we work with, we stand behind and we fully recommend. But as it is for all finishes and fixtures, there are upgrades. So if cost is something that, I really want to keep down, there are finishes, really like flooring. Flooring's the main thing, even while you have certain requirements, let's say for our operating rooms or procedure rooms, that it has to be like a heat welded continuous flooring. There's different finishes that meet those requirements that come at a lower cost and a better cost option that we can certainly suggest. And the other thing where I see a lot of cost savings maybe is like the light fixtures. So if there are certain like fixtures that are in stock, so they have very quick lead time, let's say 2 to 3 weeks. If you're not doing anything specialty, we can get those in stock and they meet the requirements of your space. So that helps down on cost and lead time. We certainly recommend having wall protection, maybe in your procedure rooms and your operating rooms. And so sad when you have this brand new space and then all of a sudden these stretchers come through and it's boom, boom, boom,
Boom.
banging
Yeah.
up against it. And you just have these dents in your beautiful walls.
Yes.
So it is an added cost to get this wall protection, but at the end of the day, it really helps and it helps protect your walls. That's their job. But even with wall protection, there are levels of standards where you have a lower, not, I don't want to say lower end. I don't feel that's a lower end, but a stainless steel is
Or
going to be pretty expensive, pretty high up there versus, kind of like
maybe
more of
some
a
plastic.
plastic,
Mm.
yeah, plastic wall covering, but they'll still both protect your walls. Hanging a curtain for your bays is a lot less expensive than building a wall or enclosing a room. They're both meet the requirements, both meet the code for your bays. You don't have to do one or the other, but it really comes down to your preference because obviously if you have a wall, you're going to get a little more acoustical privacy than if you just have a curtain. But that does help save money. And obviously there's also savings in what curtain you select. There's
Right.
really nice, beautiful ones, and then there's more kind of standard ones. But that certainly helps. And acoustics is, I don't want to like in a way like skimp on acoustics when you're
Sure.
in this type of setting, because you do have your patients, you do have your privacy, you do have your HIPAA, so
Okay.
you want to make sure that you're meeting those so that there's not going to be as much opportunity to save on items like that, like walls, and if they go all the way to the floor above, as you would in, let's say, an office setting, just because acoustics are pretty critical in these spaces. But maybe there's some where you could have a little more flexibility. But those are definitely some items. And now, honestly, too, even your doors, a painted door still functions the same way, still looks great. It's a lot less expensive than a stained door
Right.
or a door with plastic laminate. That doors are expensive. They're very expensive. And yeah, painting them is going to cost a lot less than staining or plastic laminating them.
What are other preventable errors?
Yeah, I mean, I think some things up front to be aware of is a lot of times when if you're leasing a space, right, and you talk with your landlord and your broker, and your landlord says, "Here, I've got money for you for a tenant allowance." They call it a TI allowance. Usually, landlords, especially if they're not in a medical type setting, they have kind of a specific number that they stick with. So let's say it's $60 a square foot. That is your tenant allowance for this space. I don't care what you're doing, that's your tenant allowance for this space. So if you have 3,000 square feet and you're getting 60 dollars a square foot, what's that, 180,000? If you're doing a one room facility, it's going to cost more than 180,000.
Sure.
So just keep that in the back of your mind that, so there's no surprises, honestly. Just
Right.
understanding that if there is a TI allowance, what is that? And you could get an estimate from your architect or even a builder. If there's a contractor you have, just sometimes they just run in square footage. Usually it's based on what's been happening lately, like
Right.
market value of what ASCs are getting built for per square foot, and looking at your space, but just something to keep in mind, because that's tough to see when we've certainly had it where the physician gets this allowance and then they see the final price and realize that, hey, it's not going to cover everything. So
Right.
just definitely keep that in mind. If you're going to engage your architect ahead of time with schematic design, so schematic design will include your test fits, and a lot of times, if you're already engaged with them, there's going to be a certain number of test fits that contract holds. Sometimes the landlord will pay for one. Maybe it's like 5 or 10.
Exactly.
At the end of the day, you just want your space to be what works for you, but just don't want anyone to get caught off guard of a glass entry door. And if you have an ASC and your main entrance is that glass entry door, a fire rated glass entry door is extremely expensive. So if that's a requirement, that's something it doesn't say don't go here, but it's something to know up front, so that space can be designed in a way that if you're required to have that certain type of door, that
Right.
you're not paying a lot just to have that. Try your best to find a building that has sprinklers. There's still some out there that don't, and it is really tough to be able to meet everything and design a space when the building doesn't have sprinklers. It just has a lot more restrictions. Ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for joining Operationally Speaking today.